The first General Conference of the Principle of Motor Control and Learning of Exercise, Sports and Dance is called to order. The momentous agenda of this meeting is for the discussion of stages of motor learning, effects of motor skills, and concept of motor learning theories, of which will be presented by various speakers in their respective domains of matters. In accordance with the program educational objectives numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, I am summoning the presence of the speakers to rise from their comfort and lead the audiences with effective and across-the-board education. It is now duly commenced. The conference will now begin its learning experience. I earnestly welcome 4 of the sedulous speakers, namely Ms. Angelica Sagabaen, Ms. Christine Joy Muya Lumanda, Ms. Kylene Kokoy, and Ms. Shaina May Dablo with their varied topics of motor skills and motor learning and its theories. To begin the first discussion, I would like to grant the floor to Ms. Angelica Sagabaen with her topics, theories on motor learning stages, that entails the stages of movements with the coordination of a coach and an individual, and the stages of learning sports skills that assist an athlete in developing and guiding their skills in 3 progressive stages.
Thank you for welcoming me. So, now, let's be real for a moment. I'm sure you still know how difficult learning a new task, just like new lessons, musical instruments, and sports, and becoming really good at anything is even harder to go from being rookie into do professionally. A long process that requires heaps of practice, a bit of feedback, and tons of motivation. Today, we're going to take a look at the lengthy process, breaking it down into 3 key stages of learning. This is developed by Paul Fitz and Michael Posner described this well-known characteristic of motor learning in 1967. These progressive stages are known as cognitive, the associative, and the autonomous stages of skills acquisition for each stage. I'm gonna give you key characteristics to remember which help you to differentiate between the 3. Okay? The first stage is cognitive stage, and it is all about the basics. At this point, you've never done the skill before and you're trying to learn what to do and how to do it, which brings us onto the first key characteristic of this stage. Big mistakes, and lots of them. At this stage, your technique is probably going to be all over the place. You were making lots of mistakes, and it's going to be a lot of inconsistency, which leads us to the second key characteristic of the cognitive stage. Feedback has to be external, and this is super important at this stage. You're not receiving any internal feedback as you aren't able to criticize your own ability very well. For example, if you're trying to learn how to do layup and you take 3 steps instead of 2 before shootings, you probably won't even notice. That's why having a coach to provide ongoing positive feedback on what you need to improve. Okay? Another characteristic of this stage is developing a clear mental picture of the skills, like for example, with our basketball player breaking up the key movements of a layup and visualizing them, having a clear mental picture of executing the skill while developing an athlete's understanding of how the skill should be performed. This is also why we call the cognitive stage. Remember, cognitive refers to think, so in this stage, we're still having to think really hard when trying to complete the skill. Okay, guys, so that is the cognitive stage. Big mistakes, external feedback, and the need to form a clear mental picture are all key characteristics. Once we have started to get the basics, you move up into the associative stage. In the associative stage, it's time to start improving technique and skill execution. The first key characteristic of this stage is it's all about the practice. In the associative stage, there is a lot of repetition of the skill as the athlete works on technical aspects such as timing, fluidity, and sequencing. For example, how to do taekwondo kicks. He or she practice it over and over, moving at a concentration pace. Repetitive practice creates the synchronization between the brain and body, which helps us to develop a deep awareness of how to perform a skill effectively, bringing us onto aspects. In the associative stage, the learner's internal feedback and kinesthetic sense will begin to develop. Now, your kinesthetic that extent is your awareness of your body's movement and position in space. It's that sense you get when you know you've performed a skill correctly or completely wrong. For example, an athlete begin to sense when he or she made a mistake before seeing the outcome. The intrinsic feedback is the mental feedback that give yourself on how you perform. So if the athletes perform their certain sports and miss the intrinsic feedback because he didn't do enough, this is where the differences, the cognitive stage come in. In the associative stage, the play really starts to be able to understand and improve the movement while they supply areas as they go. This also explain why it's called the associative stage. It's where the players start to associate the way they're moving with their positive and negative outcomes, so they can start to understand what works well and what doesn't. The two hand in hand as they gain knowledge of their performance from the kinesthetic sense. It is translated into the intrinsic feedback. The third key characteristic of the associative stage is less errors. The learner will make less errors, and they did in the cognitive stage, and the errors will be less frequent. This is because the athlete's improvement. The learner might make one mistake out of five. All right, that wraps up the associative stage. It's all about practice, internal feedback, kinesthetic sense, and less errors. Now you can progress from associative into the autonomous stage. But doing this is pretty difficult and requires a lot of dedication. The learner has a high degree of accuracy and consistency in performing the skill making. The first characteristic, the skill comes automatically and fluently. The athlete's kinesthetic sense is well developed, and this skill comes a second nature, which means they don't have to think about how the skill should be executed, they just do it. It's automatic. For example, if the athlete is autonomous level, they learn how to think about the process of the movement. They'll just do it. Um, all right. The second aspect or characteristic of the autonomous stage is athlete ability to redirect focus instead of focusing on the execution of the skill. They are able to concentrate on other cues or external factors like opposition to improve the performance. This means training session for autonomous level players should mimic pressurized game or competition situations. The base skills are almost too easy for them. All right. The final characteristic is the type of feedback. At this stage, the athlete is able to detect and correct pretty much all of their errors. Their feedback is almost entirely intrinsic. Now, you may be thinking, if they can give themselves all their own feedback, why do let athletes still have coaches? Remember, Not everyone's perfect. There's of course going to be a few minor corrections that athletes need at this stage, but they may not immediately pick up on themselves. Coaches tend to have good scientific understanding of the sports to help fix biochemical errors, but for the most part, athletes can rely on their internal feedback. So, guys, that's all the three stages of learning: cognitive, associative, and autonomous stages. Remember, the cognitive stage is all about the learning the basic of a skills. You're still having to think about it hard just to get the basics. Then once you've nailed the basics, you're moving into the associative stage. Here is all about practice and working on improving things like techniques and timing. Most people never progress past this stage, but if you do, you move into the autonomous stage. This is where you are pretty much a pro. Much a pro athletes don't really have to think about the performance of the skill. It comes automatically, so you can focus on other things like the opposition. So to help you to remember, let's think of this like learning the basics, always practice, and being a pro. All right, guys, that's all. Thank you. Okay, is there any question, clarification, violent reaction? Yes?
Good morning, ma'am. I have a question. What are the cognitive characteristics of 5 years old novice swimming child? And everything related to motor learning, psychological and kinetic tests and measurements compatible with the study. Thank you po.
We know that the characteristic of children's development stages are mainly influenced by more than one factor. Um, we can evaluate cognitive characteristics of a 5-year-old child in swimming education by looking at these factors. Accordingly, the primary thing we will keep in mind is that we need to make an assessment without being completely dependent on the calendar age of the child, because the factors I mentioned do not develop at this same level in every child. However, the effort may still be toward establishing minimum criteria for the cognitive characteristics of children of this age. Thank you. And yes,
According to Fitz and Postner, learning passes through three stages. Can you describe the key characteristics of each of these stages?
since I already discussed the key characteristics, I give you an additional knowledge of the key characteristic of each stages in order to easy to determine. Stage 1, cognitive stage. Learner is using trial and error learning, getting an idea of the skill, many mistakes made, movement is inconsistent, movement lacks fluency, performer concentrates on every aspect of the movement. Stage 2, associative stage. Movement is smoother, subroutines link, performer can use kinesthetic feedback, motor programs are formed, practice required, and awareness of mistakes. Stage 3, autonomous stage. Movement are automatic, no conscious thought or attention required. Tactics and strategies can be focused on. Reaction time is reduced. Detailed external feedback can be used. Errors can be detected and corrected without help. Must practice to remain in this stage. Fluent following. All right, guys, that's all. Thank you.
For the second discussion of the conference, I would like to grant the floor to Ms. Christine Joy Muya Lumanda with her topics Berenstein's three-stage model that tackles about the emphasis of the independent number of movements to complete actions in learning new motor skills, and Gentile two-stage model that accentuates the influence of task and environmental characteristics on the goal of learners.
So thank you, Mr. Jerian, for that brief yet precise introduction. So at this juncture, allow me to discuss to all of you the continuation of Miss Sagabain's talk. So without further ado, let us start, and I will introduce to you the second type of model under the three stages of motor learning. So the second stage will be the Bernstein three-stage model. So if we talk about the Bernstein three-stage model, it was created by Nikolai Bernstein, and it emphasizes quantifying degrees of freedom, where this concept addresses motor control in two ways. First, it can be used to describe restrictions of movements by limiting the range of motion. Second, it accounts for the strategy to limit a variety of motions used to accomplish a certain task. So it's more on methods or way to accomplish a certain activity. So moreover, Bernstein described the process by three stages, which are initial stage, advanced stage, and expert stage. So first will be the initial stage. So in this stage, individual simplifies a movements by reducing a degrees of freedom. So let's say for example, before a child can walk, she learns to figure out first how to sit, crawl, and stand. So the characteristic of initial stage talks about the skill acquisition begins by solving a motor problem, or what we learn at this level translate to other tasks. In addition to that, it develops a motor representation or strategy to approach a problem.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1.
So second will be the advanced stage. So individual gains a few degrees of freedom on this stage, so which permits movements in more articulations involved in the task. So in this stage, after the correction being made by the child starts to correct her movements. So it was all about identifying the most appropriate sensory corrections. So if we talk about corrections, these are handed to the background level and are engaged without conscious awareness. So this was all about advanced stage, starting to correct movements. So next will be the third and last stage under the Bernstein three-stage model, which is the expert stage. So when we say expert stage, from the word itself expert, it means specialist. So let's say for example, a dancer performed very well. It is because he or she is on expert stage. He able to possess all the degrees of freedom to carry out to the task in an effective and coordinated manner.
Every time, I'm my motherfucking friend. She been down since the jellies and the bobos. Now me stepping out the Jeep, got my nut lows. When we pull up to the scene, they be filled with jealousy. If a bitch get finicky, she gon' bring the energy. I hit my best friend.
So do you have any clarifications or questions under this Bernstein three-stage model?
Excuse me, ma'am, I have a question. What will be the big difference of the expert stage among the other stage that you have mentioned?
Okay, the main and big difference can be visible in the changes aspect, for there is a development take place. So it solves motor problem consistently under a variety of conditions. Moreover, the key concept or components in this stage are harmony, standardization, and stabilization. And it was all about teaching the learner how to function with the rest of the body in different conditions. So in general, expert stage is when we are specialists of a particular motor movement. So next, we will tackle about the Gentiles two-stage model, which is the initial stage of learning and the later stage of learning. So first will be the initial stage of learning. So in this stage, we're able to understand first the purpose of the task, develop movement strategies appropriate for completing the task, and interpreting environmental information that is relevant to organizing movement. So the characteristic of this initial stage was all about acquiring movement coordinations, and also it discriminates about the regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. In general, initial stage is an exploration of movement, or should I say, it is all about trial and error. So we are on the later stage of learning. So in this stage, fixation or diversification and adapting movement to change take place. So it is a setting that we're able to perform the task consistently and efficiently. So it is just like the expert stage on Bernstein model. Moreover, it is the capability of adapting movement pattern. So in general, later stage talks about increased consistency. So again, do you have any questions or clarification under this Gentiles two-stage model?
For you, ma'am, what model did you prefer as your basis on theory's motor learning stage?
So from my own, my dear student, I would prefer to base with the Bernstein three-stage of model, which has an initial stage, advanced stage, and expert stage. For it shows concise development of movement for me because every stage is an accurate step to develop and learn motor movements. Although in Gentiles model, it still emphasizes two-stage, but unlike Bernstein three-stage model, the second one, namely the advanced stage, is visible to us, for it tackles about the development of child through making corrections. So additional learnings, when we talk about motor skills, it is a task that requires voluntary control over movements of the joints and body segments to achieve a specific goal. So always remember that learning takes time. For in fact, every matters on this world counts, and we should trust the process because every stage we will encounter is a development or a way to achieve our own goals. So this ends my discussion. Thank you.
The time was well spent with profound information thanks to Miss Christine Joy Muya Lumanda with her erudition. The third discussion will be imparted by Miss Kylene Kokoy with her topic Smidge Scheme Theory that deals with the understanding of human movement, the activation and coordination of muscles and limbs in the performance of a motor skill through the function of neuromuscular system. Miss Kylene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jerry Yan, for the wonderful introduction. I assume that you already know the importance of theories on motor learning stages that was tackled by Ms. Sagabaen and Ms. Lumanda. Those topics on motor learning stages are theoretical frameworks used to understand the process of learning of motor skills. This juncture, I will introduce to all of you the schema theory that is under the theories of motor learning that deals with the understanding of human movement outside traditional biomechanical interventions and how the neuromuscular system functions to activate and coordinate the muscle and limbs involved in the performance of a motor skill. This theory was proposed by Richard Scheme in 1975 to explain how we learn and perform discrete perceptual motor skills. It was all about trial and error and how each type of skills that we already possess and are related to each other, but they have different functions to do in order for the human being be fully functional and well aware of his or her surroundings. He proposed that motor programs are stored in the memory by generalizing the rules such as spatial and temporal patterns of muscle activities that is needed to carry out a given movement. The schemes theory is that schemas or schemata are units of understanding that can be categorized as well as webbed into complex relationships with one another. For example, think of a house. You probably get an immediate mental image of something out a kid's storybook, like for windows, front doors, suburban settings, and chimneys. In order for us to perform a skill, we need three things: the generalized motor program, the recall schema, and the recognition schema.
A generalized motor program is defined as an abstract representation of a class of actions or patterns of movements that can be modified to yield various response outcomes. We will examine the act of passing a soccer ball as an example of a generalized motor program. There are underlying features that cannot be changed, which are called invariant features. The first invariant feature is the sequence of actions. Here, George plants his left foot near the ball, swings with his right foot, contacts the ball, and follows through to plant his right foot. This is an invariant feature because if the sequence of actions is reversed, the actions in the opposite order do not constitute a pass. The second invariant feature is the relative timing or internal rhythm of a skill. This chart shows a breakdown of the approximate relative timing of the elements of the skill regardless of the duration of the entire skill. The final invariant feature is the relative force or the ratio of force to weight of an object. Here, George demonstrates the difference in the relative force necessary to strike a ball versus the relative force necessary to strike a balloon. The parameters, on the other hand, are features that are modifiable for variations in the task. The four parameters are overall duration, overall force, movement direction, and muscle selection. The overall duration is the speed at which the skill is performed, or when George passes the ball at a slow pace versus a fast pace. The overall force is the total amount of force used for a movement. For example, a hard pass versus a soft pass. Movement direction involves variations in movement to accomplish a goal. Here we see how the movement direction of both George and the ball change from a regular pass to a pass intended to hit a specific target. The last parameter, muscle selection, refers to the different muscles activated to perform a task. Here, George uses different muscles to execute a pass with the inside of his foot than he does to execute a pass with the outside of his foot. All of these parameters and invariant features are contained within a generalized motor program that George can utilize whenever he needs to execute a pass.
The recall schema provides parameter values to the GMP after observing your situations and intentions. For example, if your badminton opponent has just cleared the shuttle to the back left corner of your court, then the recall schema will feed parameters of direction and speed to a GMP for doing a split step followed by a sequence of foot movements that is designed to get you in position to hit the shuttle. Another example for the recall schema is a basketball training. The recall schema in a response class of discrete movements was investigated, with variability of practice being manipulated before transfer to a new instance in the response class. After the transfer, the varied practice group performance was superior to the continuous practice group. The interaction of the low and high variability groups from training to recall performance supported the prediction that a group with more variable training would exhibit an increased rate of learning when introduced to a new instance of response class. After 2 days, the superiority of high variability group over the low disappeared, suggesting the memory representations of the two groups were no different under the withdrawal of knowledge of results. Recognition schema is an abstract representation of movement that centrally organizes and controls the many degrees of freedom involved in performing an action. Before the movement, as information about initial position or perhaps the tune to spinal apparatus. During the movement, when it is either monitored for the presence of error or used directly in the modulation of movements reflexively. And after the movement, that determine the success of the response and contribute to the motor learning.
Hello ma'am, good morning. About the theory of Smith scheme theory by Richard Smith, how it helps individual people to improve the way they think, they act, and also how it works.
A schema theory are categorized of information stored in long-term memory. A schema contains group of linked memories, concepts, or words. This group of things acts as a cognitive shortcut, making storing new things in your long-term memory and retrieval of them much quicker and more efficient. When an individual makes movements, short-term memory stores 4 things. First, initial movement conditions such as position of body and weight of object manipulated. Second, the parameter used such as force. The third, the outcome of the movement. Fourth, the sensory consequences of movement such as feeling, looking, and sound. Schema theory premised on the open-loop control system where the system takes input under the consideration and doesn't react on feedback to obtain the output. This system works under fixed conditions where there are no disturbance or variations. The process in an open-loop control system has advantages, limitations, and clinical implications. The advantages are simple and economical, construction is easier, stable, inaccurate, and unreliable. Changes in the outputs due to external disturbance are not corrected automatically. The open-loop control system has also its limitations. First one, the lack of specificity of interaction with other systems during motor learning and how the generalized motor programs created can account for immediate acquisitions of new types of coordination. The motor learning has clinical implications also. First one, task practice under the many different conditions. Positive benefits for error reduction. Schema has rules for all stored elements, not just correct elements. This time, I present to all of you the process in an open-loop control system.
Today, we will talk about open-loop control systems. For this, we're going to visit your house and see if we can find everyday examples. Let's start with the kitchen. One of the devices you use daily is your toaster. You place a slice of bread in it, then set its timer, and when it's done, your toast pops out. The bread's color has changed based on the timer setting you chose. Here, the toaster with the bread is an open-loop system that takes an input time and gives an output bread color. Now, suppose that you're using the toaster for the first time. You don't know what setting the timer should be at to get your desired bread color. In this case, you can do a couple of experiments. You can input different timer settings and wait until your output settles to a value, then mark your findings on this plot. Putting a slice of bread in the toaster and setting the timer to a level of 2 gives you, let's say, light brown bread. In the next experiment, for an input of level 4, you get medium brown. And in the last one, your input is 6 and you get a dark brown color. If you now fit a curve through these points, this represents the model of the toaster with the bread at steady state. Remember that you want to find the time setting for your desired bread color. To find this mathematically, let's equate the input to U and the output to Y. In the experiments, for different values of U, you found the corresponding values of Y. So you can write Y as a function of U. But now you want to do the opposite. Given the desired value of Y, you want to calculate the value of U. In mathematical terms, this corresponds to taking the inverse of the function. Therefore, to calculate the time you need for your desired bread color, you take the inverse of it. See, open-loop control is really easy. Let's jump to another room and see if we can find an open-loop system there. Oh, this is little Timmy who wants to take a warm shower, but he's not tall enough to turn the shower handle. So he asks for your help. In this open-loop system, the handle position is the input and water temperature is the output. To help little Timmy, you turn the handle to different positions, and based on this, the water temperature changes. Open-loop control seems to work perfectly. All you need is to do a couple of experiments, and once you have an idea of the model of your system, you can easily find the input needed to get a desired output. But are there any situations where open-loop control may fail? Reconsider the toaster example. Through trial and error, you found that setting the timer to 3 gives you your desired bread color. But what happens when you use a different type of bread, like a bagel? You may end up having a burnt bagel because the time settings you found by trial and error were for a slice of bread.
Motor learning theories deal with understanding of human movement outside traditional biomechanical interventions and how the neuromuscular system functions to activate and coordinate the muscles and lines involved in the performance of the motor skills.
I thank Miss Kylene Kokoy for the well-versed discourse imparted. Miss Kylene, thank you. For the final discussion of the conference, I would like to ask the presence of Miss Shaina May Dablo in presenting her topic, Adams' Closed-Loop Theory, that is based on basic motor learning research, focusing on slow, graded linear positioning tasks which involve error detection and correction in meeting goal demands. The stage is yours, Miss Shaina.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Jerry, and good day to each and everyone present in our first general conference of the Principles of Motor Control and Learning of Exercise, Sports, and Dance. I am very honored to be able to stand here before you to deliver the second theory of the motor learning. I will entertain questions later after my speech, so with no further ado, let me introduce you the Adams closed-loop theory. The Adams closed-loop theory was proposed by J.A. Adams in 1971. This theory works only on basic motor learning skills with simple and slow movement based upon the concept of closed-loop process of motor control, where it relies on sensory feedback used for the ongoing production of skilled movement. The more practice of the specific movement of the individual, the stronger the perceptual trace and the less incorrect movement would become. Adams' closed-loop theory suggested that processing of afferent information was central in human motor control. It is based in the basic motor learning research that focused on slow, graded, linear positioning tasks which involved error detection and correction to meet goal demands. This theory states the following: the decisions are made in the brain, not all information is sent together, information is received by our muscles to initiate the intended actions of movements, feedback is available and vital in order to correct certain movement patterns and adapt to the changing needs. The process in the closed-loop theory starts in the input, then perceptual mechanism, next is the memory trace, perceptual trace, then the motor action, which is the output. Input is the stimuli that is perceived by our senses like smell, sight, touch, taste, and hearing, or anything that is perceived using your senses can be called sensory input. Perceptual mechanism is the action required to transform sensory information into workable knowledge. The three perceptual mechanisms we will focus on are expecting, attending, and information processing. Memory trace selects and initiates an appropriate response. The perceptual trace acts as a record of the movement made over many practices. Then the motor action, or the output, is where the information will be put into action. During and after an attempt of the movement, feedback and knowledge of results enable the performer to compare the movement with the perceptual trace. The trace acts as a reference of correctness so that appropriate errors adjustment can be made for subsequent attempt of the movement. It is accomplished by incoming feedback to the perceptual trace, which is formed from the sensory consequences of the limb being at the incorrect endpoint in the past experiences. In the event of errors, the limb is adjusted until the movement is appropriate to the goal of the action. Importantly, the more accurate the movement, the more useful the perceptual trace that is collected and restrained. This theory also has its limitation and clinical implication. Limitations can't explain accurate performance of open-loop movements made in absence of sensory feedback. May be impossible to store separate perceptual trace for every single movement. May improve motor performance of tasks when practicing movements in various ways than practicing a single movement endpoint alone. Clinical implications. Performs the same exact movement repeatedly to one accurate endpoint. Increased practice, increased learning. Errors produced during learning increase strength of incorrect perceptual traits. Accuracy of a movement is proportional to the strength of the perceptual traits. Now I will give you an example. For example, you are practicing running. The input is the action, which is you are starting running. Process will be your action necessary to maintain your desired goal, which is to finish one lap within 60 seconds, and that will be your desired output. While you are in the process of your action, you ended up being able to reach your desired time, which is 1 minute. And the feedback will help you distinguish the problem you made in your practice, whether you are going too fast or too slow. With the help of your senses, you are able to know what are the adjustments you need to do in order for you to achieve the goal you want. So you will repeat the entire process in a better way while applying the adjustments that you discovered. So, any questions? As what I have said, we will focus on the three perceptual mechanisms, which are the expecting, attending, and information processing. Expecting. In the expecting perceptual mechanism, a person anticipates what will happen or what an object will be based on their sensory information and the related schemata they possess. Essentially, this is the anticipation step where they call up the necessary schema or relate to a given experience. Correct expectation reinforces the schema, while incorrect expectation requires assimilation. Attending. The attending perceptual mechanism is absolutely essential to learning and assimilating experience into existing schemata or forming new schema. The individual has to focus on the object, experience, or relationship between them in order to actually gain the new information. This is why attention deficit hyperactive disorder or ADHD can be detrimental to learning. Information processing. It is the perceptual mechanism that incorporates the new information into schemata or forms a new schema to incorporate the experience. Essentially, it is the series of logical steps and memory formation needed in the assimilation steps of schema formation. One problem with closed-loop theory is that it ultimately reduces to a response training theory. Each movement or component of a movement is assumed to be triggered by a perceived error. Yet many movement sequence can be performed effectively when feedback is removed. Any other questions? Okay, none. So thank you very much for listening and cooperating with me.
I thank Ms. Shaina May Dablo for the educational discussion. In this conference, myriad of domains in motor learning has eventually provided by our sedulous speakers that unveil the concepts, stages, and theories about the body movements, environmental characteristics, coordination of neuromuscular system, and rectification of the errors in the demands of goal in which address in a formal gathering with eyes, ears, and minds fixated on the purpose of nurturing the learning experience of physical education. It is truly vouched that expertise in this field is honed through the guidance of developing the body movements and skills which are substantiated by studies that are instructed in the best possible way. There is nothing left to be discussed within this meeting. I will now adjourn the meeting, and before it transpires, I am advising every audience to exit the chamber upon the adjournment of the meeting. The meeting is adjourned.